everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important discussion on accelerating the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals and shaping a holistic post-2030 agenda. I'm Dr. Jackson Z, Global Affairs and Disaster Resilience Director at Four Paws International, and I am honored to be your moderator for today's session. So today we're here to explore how a comprehensive and holistic approach, one that respects all forms of life, can help us not only meet our 2030 goals, but also create a foundation for sustainable development beyond 2030. We hope to discuss the intersections of health, food systems, animal welfare, and sustainable development, focusing on the immediate actions that can drive progress in the next 6 years, going up to 2030. So on behalf of the World Federation for Animals, I'd like to extend a special thanks to our co-hosts, the Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island Developing States for their collaboration. I also, of course, like to welcome our esteemed speakers and participants from member states, the United Nations, the Brook, our friends and colleagues, partners, and other distinguished organizations. So now we can begin. So as we approach 2030, it's clear that accelerating progress on the Sustainable Development Goals is critical. Our discussions here today will focus on practical strategies to achieve these goals, while laying the groundwork for a sustainable future. So we'll explore how integrating One Health approach, promoting ethical food systems, and prioritizing animal welfare is essential to this effort. But before we start, we have activated the Q&A function, the question and answer function for this Zoom. If you have any questions that you would like our panelists to discuss, please use the Q&A function and submit those. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly afterwards. The recording may capture personal identifiable information, such as your name or any other content you submit via the Q&A function. If you do not wish to have your data recorded, please use a non-identifiable display name when joining the webinar and refrain from submitting any personal information in the Q&A. Your participation in this webinar implies consent on these terms. So if you have any concerns or do not wish to give consent to be recorded, please inform us or leave our session now before we begin. Without further ado, please let me introduce our esteemed speakers today for this panel discussion. I'd like to introduce Ms. Anna Mary, the Senior Global External Affairs Advisor from the Brook. Anikit Guy, Senior Economic Affairs Officer from the United Nations Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and the Small Island Developing States. And Mr. Arjan van Heuligen, Chief of Strategic Policy and Public Affairs from the World Federation for Animals. So let's start with our first focus, which is how animal welfare is critical, often overlooked component of sustainable development and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Anna, how does prioritizing animal welfare contribute to the accelerated achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jackson. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here with us. My name is Anna Mary. I work for Brook Action for Working Horses and Donkeys. We are also proudly a member of WFA. As Jackson said, next week, the Summit of the Future is kicking off in New York. And I'm sure we will hear a lot about holistic approaches, very rightly so. We cannot afford to work in silos anymore. We know it doesn't work. However, animal welfare still remains one of those unacknowledged areas, and yet it is absolutely crucial and relevant for sustainable development. So I'd like to offer an overview, and I know colleagues will then follow on some specific aspects. So I'll just quickly run through a few visuals to give you the appreciation of where animal welfare really fits. I hope my screen is visible. Jackson's nodding. So here I have scribbled all over the SDGs as we know them, where what I've circled in red is where it's most obvious that animal welfare and animals fit in. But really, we could talk about how animals and animal welfare fit into every one of the goals. People have been living alongside animals for millennia. And yet we don't have animal welfare yet fully acknowledged in sustainable development. So as I said, it's an overview. I'll talk you through a few examples, and then colleagues will provide a deeper dive into some of those aspects. Brook is a working animal NGO. For us, SDG number 1, no poverty, is where animal welfare is absolutely essential. Animals are a source of livelihoods in agriculture, in transport, through the trade in animal source products. According to FAO estimates, 1.3 billion people in the world depend on livestock. More depend on wildlife as well. I'll be focusing more on livestock here because that's what Brooke knows most about. Those people who depend on livestock are some of the poorest and most vulnerable people. Why do we have to prioritize animal welfare? Because animals in good welfare can help people lift themselves out of poverty. We cannot leave those people behind. The second example that's probably also fairly obvious is the link between animal welfare and zero hunger. Animals are obviously a source of food and nutrition, and if they are in good health and welfare, that food is safe. Animal source products are a leading cause of foodborne diseases. But also something that you may not realize, especially if you are based in the global north, is that agricultural production is absolutely dependent on animals in good health and welfare. Here you see a donkey in Senegal plowing the field. This is how agriculture is still done in the majority world, by donkey, by ox, by buffalo. Agricultural transport depends on the work of animals, of water, of other livestock. Manure is used as fertilizer in predominantly in the smallholder livestock systems that feed the world. My third example, and I know we will hear more about it later, is the health goal. Isn't it obvious now after the COVID pandemic that human health and animal health are related? Well, sadly, not fully. And yet we know that animals in good health protect people's health. But where does welfare come in? So animals in good welfare are healthier. If you imagine overcrowded conditions in which animals are kept, that leads to injuries, that leads to infection, and then that leads to increased risk of zoonotic spillover, which is simply put, animal pathogens jumping onto humans. Healthier animals in better welfare don't need as many antibiotics, which means that we can reduce the spread of antimicrobial resistance, which means that antibiotics simply don't work on human populations. We will hear much more about One Health very shortly, but I just want you to remember this number, 75%. 75% of emerging human infections come from animals. Clearly, we have to fix this. We have to protect people while protecting the animals. And this is my final example, and I know Arian will sort of connect the food and the climate bits. this is often the elephant in the room. We know that animal agriculture is a big cause of greenhouse gas emissions. We know that. We know the way to go, that we need to reduce our reliance on industrial scale animal agriculture. It can be done by reducing the scale and improving welfare. An interesting fact that you maybe did not know is that there is actually emerging evidence of how better animal health actually leads to fewer emissions. There is an FAO report that you can read that sort of maps out that connection. And we know that better welfare can lead to better animal health as well. And lastly, something that's really close to home, to Brooke, is the final point on the link between animal welfare and climate disasters resilience. This photo that you can see was taken during disastrous floods in Pakistan. You can see here animals transporting people and goods out of disaster-struck zones, out of the flooded zone. They were also bringing in medical supplies, food and water for the affected populations. And long-term, those animals can help people rebuild their livelihoods. And they can only do it if they are in good welfare. I'll stop here, and I know some of the colleagues will deepen some of these aspects. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna. Let's go on to discuss the strategies for immediate and impactful health interventions that align with long-term development goals. So let's go to Aniket. Aniket, how can the One Health approach be leveraged to accelerate the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the least developed countries, the landlocked developing countries, and the small island developing states?
Thank you very much, Jackson, for the question and also for the invitation to join this important event. And I also would like to thank Anna for her introduction. And indeed, the issue of animal welfare is a critical one for achieving the SDGs, but also one that does not receive its due attention. The three most vulnerable groups of countries, the least developed countries, the landlocked developing countries, and the small island developing states, each have their own programs of action to address their specific challenges. And these programs of action also act as an SDG accelerator. And they all include priorities on health, on climate change, and on food security, towards which a One Health approach also plays a critical role. Issues such as climate change resilience, biodiversity loss, and weak health systems are at the core of the vulnerability of these countries. So a One Health approach, including its integrated focus on the health of people, animals, and ecosystems, can help to achieve the goals and targets of these individual programs of action and also accelerate progress towards the SDGs. However, the LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS do require support to address all of these areas. Two of them are explicitly recognized in the SDGs and their programs of action. With regard to human health, allow me to delve into the example of the LDCs. So countries are determined to be in the LDC category by three criteria. One of them, and the first, is per capita GNI. The second is the so-called Human Asset Index. And the third, an Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index. The second of these is a weighted index primarily composed of education and human health indicators. So human health systems are an intrinsic measure of what it means to be in the LDC category. Let me turn now to the environment and the recently adopted Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS, which has numerous references to ecosystem health running throughout it. And indeed, nature-based solutions can help build resilience to the existential threats faced by SIDS from climate change impacts. though these types of solutions are not enough to keep up with the pace of the climate crisis. However, animal health is not explicitly reflected in these programs of action, as was mentioned in the earlier presentation. And so it is for this reason that events such as today's event are particularly important, since it brings to the fore the interconnected nature of these issues, as well as the need to focus in addition on animal health in our overall One Health approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aniket. I'd like to go on and discuss the urgent need for transformative food system practices that can deliver immediate Sustainable Development Goal results. Arjan, what role do sustainable and ethical food systems play in accelerating the Sustainable Development Goal progress, particularly in addressing hunger and climate action?
Thank you, Jackson, and thank you also to Anna and Aniket for the previous sort of interventions and the important sort of messages that they've brought. The first thing I would like to say, when it comes to sustainable ethical food systems, there is no single answer to that question, as the determination of what is sustainable will need to be context specific. We currently lack a clear typology of agri-food systems in the global policy space, and I'll get back a little later to discuss what is happening in that regard. Again, for what are ethical food systems, again, that is a somewhat subjective determination, as one person's ethics are not necessarily the same as the next person's ethics. And here, perhaps a quite crude example is a person with a lot of money in his wallet may choose high welfare products as their ethical choice, whereas a person that has very little money may choose the cheapest meat or milk or eggs because they have an ethical obligation to feed their family. So coming from an animal welfare perspective, of course, food systems that are designed specifically to protect the welfare of animals can be the most sustainable and can be the right ethical choice. Just as an example of food systems and food system development that was ostensibly done in the past to enhance sustainability of these systems can have quite unsustainable outcomes. I want to point as just an example to a development in a number of countries. I'm not going to name them here, where about 20 years ago, the decision was taken to move to large-scale monoculture based low welfare systems, which led to the crowding out of large numbers of small-scale producers, which led, of course, to increased unemployment and increased poverty. Clearly, that is an unsustainable outcome. To reflect on that and to minimize those effects, the decision was subsequently taken to legalize the farming of wildlife as exotic meats, which in turn created a market for exotic meats, which eventually then led to the emergence of COVID that we've all dealt with, and which had led to a global sort of slowdown of progress towards achieving the SDGs. So there's a good example of how the development of particular agri-food systems for the purpose of enhancing sustainability produced quite unsustainable outcomes. An additional side effect that is particularly related to the issue of climate change, of course, relates to the fact that moving to the farming of wildlife also led to the need to take wildlife out of nature which has led to a situation where a reduced number of wildlife species in forests in particular has now been proven to mean that these animals no longer act as pollinators for forests, which means that the regeneration of forests is slowed down, which in effect also has led to a situation where the carbon sequestration of these forests has significantly reduced. And the latest research that has been done in this area shows that we can see about 50% reduction in carbon sequestration in oceans, in forests, as a result of the reduced abundance and lack of free movement for wildlife in these ecosystems. And we've seen similar effects from overfishing in oceans, where marine animals, particularly fish, play a very important role in the sequestration of greenhouse gas emissions through the oceans. And of course, as we all talk about a desire to come to net zero by 2050, net zero, of course, is an equation where the total emissions equals total sequestration. So if we reduce the ability of the planet to sequester carbon, we'll need to significantly increase efforts to reduce emissions. And so the types of systems that we built and the effects that it has, both in terms of the ability of the planet to sequester carbon, as well as the food systems and their sort of overall emissions, are issues that we need to take into account to determine what are sustainable food systems, particularly livestock systems. Now, there is currently a global process underway to determine a transfer or the right strategy to transform to more sustainable livestock systems. And that process is currently happening in the context of the FAO Subcommittee on Livestock. And that development of a strategy is built on a global assessment that has been undertaken over the past years that clearly show that high input systems are the most economically effective and efficient. But that, of course, does not include the current sort of public costs that are associated with these systems. Mixed farming systems where livestock and crop production are combined are considered to be the best systems when it comes to a balanced approach across the three dimensions of sustainable development. And extensive systems have been found to be the most effective when it comes to the environmental dimension of sustainable development in and of itself. The FAO Subcommittee on Livestock will develop a new strategy for the transformation of the livestock sector to become more sustainable, and that process will hopefully come to conclusion in 2026. So that is an area where many of us can try and engage to make sure that what we believe to be the most sustainable and ethical food systems and try and bring an animal welfare perspective to those discussions. Animal welfare as a sort of driver of sustainability has, of course, been recognized by member states in the UN systems for quite some time, particularly the Committee on World Food Security since 2014 has acknowledged that promoting animal welfare is key to delivering good health outcomes for people, both in terms of food safety, but also as the key mean by which we can sustainably increase productivity. That was confirmed again by the Committee on World Food Security in 2016, when they delivered their recommendations for sustainable agriculture, and particularly in the livestock sector. And again, only last year in 2023, when FAO in its sustainable livestock transformation framework acknowledge the need to integrate animal welfare in all livestock systems. So now to talk a little bit about what can particular animal welfare advocates do and need to do in the foreseeable future to reinvigorate an animal welfare perspective in the determination of what agri-food systems are sustainable, I would point to two areas of work. One is we need to have better evidence on the economics of animal welfare. The dominant factor for member states to be hesitant about promoting animal welfare is because it is still considered to be a cost factor. It is considered to be something that increases the cost of production and potentially lowers productivity. The second element is that we need to rethink and reinvigorate the sort of central principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, and namely that there is a need for a balanced and integrated approach across the three dimensions: economic, social, and environmental of sustainable development. And a close reading, for instance, of the Pacts for the Future that will be adopted by member states seems to suggest that we are moving slightly backwards, back towards a more siloed approach for each of the goals that are currently in the SDGs. And one way to try and bring that idea of a balanced and integrated approach across the three dimensions back into the discussion to allow for greater policy coherence, which was also included in the SDGs in Target 17.14, is for a way to value nature in a way that allows for comparison with how we currently value economic prosperity and social progress. It is only if we are able to value nature and investment in nature, animal welfare being a very good example of how we invest in nature and animals in particular, and the important role they play in the health of ecosystems, is going to be a very important and necessary step for us to think about. I'd leave it at that for now. Thank you.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much, Arjen. I think you answered what I was thinking for the second question. So wonderful. I'm going to pass that on to Anna. Anna, would you come back, and what steps you think can be taken to integrate animal welfare into current development strategies before 2030?
Thank you very much, Jackson, and thank you, Arjen. I think Arjen actually highlighted a few of those areas already. So I would just like to give you some examples and reiterate some of Arjen's points. So, you know, if we said that animal welfare is one of those historically overlooked sectors in the connection to sustainable development. So the first thing that needs to be done is recognition. And Arjen mentioned a few places, mostly in the FAO space, that sort of is seen as having the mandate to work on animals. That already exists. But I wanted to share examples with you of more recent examples where animal welfare and sustainable development have been connected in UN policy. Can you see this? You should be seeing a slide now. Yeah, excellent. So these are two examples of recognition in policy dating from 2022, so fairly recent. The first one is an excerpt from the UN Environmental Assembly Nexus resolution that talks specifically about how animal welfare can contribute to sustainable development goals. And then the second one is also from a bit later the same year, is the UN General Assembly Agriculture and Nutrition Resolution that again says animal health and welfare can contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. This is key. This is recognition in global policy, and we need more of this recognition elsewhere. And there are those opportunities along on the horizon as we go, including the Summit of the Future, including the upcoming COP29. We need more of this in other spaces than, you know, the traditional spaces of FAO related to agriculture. But recognition alone is not enough. We need implementation. We need implementation at the global level, and we need implementation at the national level. And it does not mean paying lip service. It means measurable targets, deadlines, step by which certain steps need to be achieved. And there is no way around it. There needs to be more investment in animal health, in animal welfare, not as a cost. I think Ariane already highlighted this. This is not a cost, it's an investment. It's something that will generate co-benefits for humans. There are lots of things we can do looking at the SDGs. We could look at current SDG indicators. Animal welfare fits really well with some of them. But as we're now more than halfway to 2030, we should be thinking about the future goals, whatever shape and form they take. That's where we need to be talking about animal health and animal welfare, the critical enablers delivering those co-benefits for people, animals, and the planet. There is a lot of discussion around alternative measures of development, thinking beyond GDP. That's where animal welfare fits really well with human well-being. This is where we should be thinking and focusing our attention as well. And more generally, we need to have animal welfare actors at the table. We shouldn't be just thinking in silos. There will be a lot of talk about breaking silos, holistic approaches, but are all those historically neglected sectors really invited and included in discussing sustainable development and the future goals? This is what we need to fix. And I know we've barely scratched the surface. This is such a huge topic. So I want to leave you with these two resources to read more about how animal welfare and the SDGs are connected, but also what it is that we can do now and in the future to make sure animal welfare delivers for the SDGs. The first is a policy brief by Brooke, focusing specifically on working animals and the SDGs. And the second on the right is an excellent report by the World Federation for Animals that unpacks that nexus of animal welfare, environment, and sustainable development. I'm sure we can share the links in the chat. So I really encourage you to take a look and learn more and continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. That was really insightful. Much to learn there. I want to go back to Annika. How can we help build resilience in the most developing is this getting better? So, and I think we asked the question.
The audio is very well. Try unplugging and replugging your mic.
Thank you for that intervention. Annika, I'd like to ask, how can we help build resilience in the most vulnerable countries against pandemics and other unforeseen situations within the 2030 framework, sir? Over to you.
Thank you very much for the question. And indeed, you touched upon one of the most important topics related to vulnerability, particularly in the context of the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and the SIDS. So when we talk about pandemics, everybody automatically thinks about COVID-19 because it's very recent and because of its devastating impact on the world in terms of loss of life and its continuing impacts in many countries. While for some, the COVID-19 pandemic is in the rearview mirror, many of the most vulnerable countries are still grappling with its impacts. So I would like to, however, step back a few years and to mention the Ebola virus disease, which was significant in a number of very important ways. First of all, it highlighted how developing countries are at the greatest risk of epidemics and pandemics, owing to a host of factors such as weak health systems, including detection and alert, equipment, vaccines, medicines, etc. Now, for those who remember back to it, the 3 most affected countries from the Ebola virus disease were all LDCs. So I think this really drives home the vulnerability of this category of countries in terms of pandemics. Now, a second point is that the Ebola experience was a stark reminder for us that disease knows no borders. This is self-evident, but it nevertheless needs to be reminded. We need to be reminded of it, so that the health of people across the world are interconnected, and more importantly, that the system is only as strong as the weakest link. And then a third fact that the Ebola crisis highlighted was the interconnected nature of human and animal health, and how we can impact on these interconnections. And I think this has been mentioned by the other presenters, and I thank Anna for having mentioned zoonotic disease and transmission, because as human activity impacts on ecosystems and natural habitats, this disturbs the environmental equilibrium and can result in the spillover of animal microbes into human populations. And furthermore, growing demand for animal-sourced foods has increased the number of livestock on farms, creating more opportunities for crossover of pathogens, as has been highlighted in previous presentations. So these facts basically were very apparent to us following the Ebola virus disease outbreak. And following that crisis, and indeed the COVID-19 crisis, there were many studies and reports done on how we can prevent the next epidemic and pandemic. I will cite, for example, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon established a panel on the global response to international health crises, which looked at Ebola and what should we do, how can we prevent it from happening again? And in a nutshell, there's sort of 2 lessons that I would like to. So there were numerous studies. Harvard had its panel. The international health regulation of the World Health Organization automatically triggers a review following a pandemic. All these studies have come up with recommendations, including on animal, the relationship with an interconnection between human and animal health and the transmission of zoonotic diseases. So from all of this, there are 2 lessons that I would like to sort of elevate out, because the numbers of recommendations and so on are vast, but we as a priority need to address, I would say, 2 of these out of this plethora of recommendations. 2 things. The first is that we must strengthen health capacities in the most vulnerable nations as a matter of the highest priority. This is clear because it's the weakest link and we are all interconnected. The second is that we need to re-evaluate our approach to food systems and the role played by animals. Now, this has been delved into in much more depth in Aryan's presentation and in Anna's to some extent. But it is clear that this relationship is not getting the understanding and the airing that it deserves. And so I was very interested also to see the next generation of SDGs being referenced, And so clearly, this is an area where we have a gap. And these two pillars, if you will, would be my sort of kind of recommendations as among this mass of different proposals on how we can strengthen our overall systems. Those two are the ones which I think merit greater attention. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers for your insightful answers and allowing us to understand and learn more through your experiences and your references. So at this point, we're going to turn our session towards the Q&A. And we will start taking some questions and aggregate them. So another team is helping us aggregate your questions. And we would like to encourage participation. So through the Q&A, if you put your questions there, our teams will help generate the questions so that we can address our speakers for this next few minutes. At this point, I'd like to, go to Anna. And Anna can have a break, and Adrian can have a break for a moment. Considering the cross-cutting nature of the issues that we discussed today, how can we foster stronger collaboration between the different sectors, like health, agriculture, the environment, to name a few, to accelerate the progress towards the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and develop a more holistic approach post-2030 agenda?
Thank you, Jackson. Well, I think I have to say this, we need to have more webinars like this one, where we are really tackling all these issues head on. But really, it needs to happen at several levels, and it won't happen overnight. It needs to happen at the level of government. So that's where the silos begin, really. The Ministry of Agriculture not talking to the Ministry of Health. This has to stop. I know that people are now more aware of it, and there are lots of efforts at the national level to create initiatives. For example, One Health is a brilliant example of getting those silos to work together. The same goes for global processes, global multi-stakeholder processes. Everybody needs to be included, from the different ministries to NGOs to the grassroots level. There is so much going on at community level. What Brook vets and Brook animal welfare workers see in villages is something that does not necessarily find a reflection in the corridors of power. People simply don't know how close populations live with animals, what gaps there are at the front line of animal health. That includes the lack or insufficient skills of animal health workers. This level needs to be sort of fed up so that the information is there, that the voices are heard. So more truly inclusive multi-stakeholder processes. But also we need to acknowledge that it won't happen overnight. It is happening. It has been happening for a while, and we need to ensure that this continues. And what I said at the end of my talk, we animal welfare actors need to have a seat at the table, but also communities need to have a seat at the table. Those communities who rely on their animals for their livelihoods, for their food, for their climate resilience, we need to hear from them. They know, they've known for ages what needs to be done.
Amazing. Thank you, Anna. I'd like to take a moment and ask Arjan, what are the key challenges, do you think, in ensuring that animal welfare is recognized as a critical component of sustainable development? And how can these challenges be addressed both before and post-2030 agenda?
Thank you, Jackson. Before addressing your question directly, let me just focus slightly on my experience over the past 20 years within the UN system and the sort of intergovernmental process, where what I have observed is that in most of the intergovernmental processes where we look at how to deal with global issues that concern all countries, whether or not it's the intergovernmental process or UN organizations, it always feels to me that there is a recognition of a need for transformative action, but the transformative action that is then proposed assigns the heavy lifting to technological advancements, innovation, more money, and a greater role for the UN, or a greater sort of focus on a sort of multilateral, multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approach. And these are the sort of natural things that governments will focus on, but what they do not yet do is to really look at what is required to achieve a real transformation. And that means we need to start thinking about more clearly that the earth is a finite resource, that we need to start thinking about what we really, really value and how we value it. And that, I think, is a process that is slowly starting. There is a process underway within the UN system to look at indicators of progress that are not purely based on GDP related factors. The IPBES is looking in how we value nature in particular, because we still find ourselves in a situation where over the past 20, 30 years, we've seen economic prosperity grow by 60%, social progress increased by about 30%, but it is at the expense of natural assets, which have decreased by 40 to 50%. And so in that kind of equation, you cannot have a truly balanced and integrated approach. You cannot have sustainable development. In most discussions with member states and UN organizations, there is a very clear understanding of the need for a transformative approach, but how to do it and who goes first, because most countries will still look at, if we go first in, let's say, really developing a sustainable agri-food system, is that going to mean that we lose our international competitiveness? Is that going to mean that foods will increase in price, which will lead to a cost of living crisis and therefore lost votes for the current government? So it does require a global approach, but it also requires a fundamental sort of rethinking about what it is that we value and how do we define growth. And that's, I think, there is a large role to be given to animal welfare organizations, because of the fact that animals are the only other sentient creatures on this planet besides human beings. They are affected by anthropological pressures the same way as humans are. So it's not just the fact that if you give an animal less food, it will be less productive, but if you stress it, it will also become less productive, the same as human beings. And so there's a particular role for animals in that process. And it is slowly being recognized. If we look at the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, for the first time, we're starting to look at the integrity of ecosystems, looking at not just the ecosystem as a whole, but what are the different elements that make that ecosystem function. There is a recognition of the need to account for how we use nature. These processes are slow, they will come, but I think for us as animal welfare organizations, there's a big role for us to demonstrate perhaps a little bit better the particular role that animals play in these systems and the services that ecosystems provide to humans. I'll leave it at that, sorry.
No, wonderful. Thank you, Arian. It's a pun, but food for thought, right? Moving on. Anna-Kit, would you come in? I would like to ask, what are the most promising opportunities for international cooperation to ensure that the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals are sustained and built upon in the post-2030 agenda?
Thank you very much for that question. I will really sort of answer it in two ways. The first is on the programs of action of the three groups of countries. So we will be convening the third UN conference on landlocked developing countries in Gaborone in Botswana. And this program of action aims to accelerate progress towards the SDGs and address the specific impediments faced by the landlocked developing countries through 5 priority areas. This program of action goes beyond the 2030 period. So these programs of action, we've already had 5 for the least developed countries. They have paid off. We have got 16 countries from the least developed country category that are in the graduation pipeline. So they're actually exiting the category because they're making progress. So these programs of action predated the 2030 agenda. They predated the Millennium Development Goals, and they will go on beyond. So these programs of action are there and they will continue, we expect. Certainly the Gaborone program of action, which will be adopted formally in December in Gaborone, Botswana, will go for a 10-year period, so through to 34. And the ABAS, Antigua and Barbuda agenda for SIDS, also goes beyond, and likewise the Doha program of action. So these, in a way, for these particular groups of countries, we've got some mechanisms in place that will carry them forward. And they accelerate progress towards the SDGs, but they go beyond that. Let me give you an example in terms of value addition. So we've talked about food, exports, and competitiveness advantage in the intervention just before. What these programs of action aim to do, and particularly that of the least developed countries, it aims at increasing the value added domestically, so that least developed countries can move up global value chains, and rather than just export coffee and have it roasted somewhere else and the value addition taking place, have the good coffee roasters at home, possibly with a competitive edge in a niche market on organic, and gain more revenue domestically rather than just have the raw materials exported. And agriculture, as we've said, is an important component of these countries' economies, up to 50–60% of value added. So these are ways where even beyond the SDGs, we will see progress in terms of well-being. Now, I'd like to just add one final point on this, because we're talking about beyond, and if I could take off my hat as a staff member of the Office of LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS, and have a sort of general reflection about the progress that we've seen, is I would say we have seen some progress in terms of taking the environmental dimension on board in terms of our overall approach at the international level. Certainly beyond GDP and serious discussion, and it is mentioned in the Pact of the Future, certainly a more serious consideration of beyond GDP would help us to move further in that direction. But I do think that we will need to have a shift in thinking in order to take on animal welfare in a new generation of SDGs. Right now, we're looking at it in terms of how it's going to complement and add to existing objectives within the SDGs, whether it is climate change, whether it is nutrition, and so on. But to see it in and of itself as a good and a potential SDG would be, I think, a transformational shift in thinking, which may or may not come about. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Love that you took off your hat and get that personal perspective. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I think we're coming very close to the end of our hour session. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their contributions. Today, we've had a rich discussion on the importance of a holistic approach to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and shaping the post-2030 agenda. We have heard about the critical role of health, food systems, animal welfare, many other aspects, and how they interconnect and intersect to create a sustainable, equitable future for everyone. A few takeaways from our discussion. First, I believe, in taking my notes, the urgency of integrating a One Health approach to address interconnected challenges of human, animal, and environmental health is absolutely important. Secondly, the importance of an ethical and sustainable food system that ensures food security, climate resilience, the entire chain, all the people that are involved, particularly those in the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states, representing more than half the world's population. And third, the critical need to prioritize animal welfare as a fundamental component of sustainable development. So with that, we hope that's going to be our future. So as we move forward, it is crucial that we take these discussions beyond this forum today and integrate these principles into policies, programs, partnerships, collaborating bridging across our silos, our sector into other areas, which would be great. So let's commit to accelerating the progress of SDGs while also ensuring that our future development agendas are inclusive, holistic, sustainable. So once again, I'd like to thank all of our wonderful participants for their engagement and thoughtful questions. Your contributions are absolutely essential to driving forward this agenda today. Please stay connected with us for further updates, collaborative opportunities, as we continue to work together towards these goals, right? Find these synergies. So once again, thank you for your time and dedication to these issues. Let's continue to work together to realize a better future for all. Have a great day and have a great Summit of the Future. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackson. Thank you, Annika.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.